Sometime around January 20th, 1981, I found myself stepping out of a Boeing 747 that had just landed in Paya Lebar Airport, Singapore. Young and disorientated, I stood for a while at the top of the stairs, breathing in the heavily mysterious and alien humidity of a tropical night, before walking the steps down onto the tarmac and into contact with this foreign land. I had in truth no clear idea or even preconception of the place I had just reached. Fresh out of my photo school and carrying a large format portfolio of my recent graphic experiments, I had come to Singapore to work in advertising in a company started a couple of years earlier by Xavier Germenk, a university friend. The company bore the French name of a seagull, Mouette. And prior to that drastic change of continents, Xavier had also been instrumental in diverting my path from architecture studies to photography. Answering his invitation, I had come to contribute to the fast-growing economy of a tiny red dot that was beginning to be regarded as an economic miracle. And although not quite aware of the full implications, I somehow had a sense that it also meant the emergence of a society based on images and information. Back home, as in back in France, Barthes had just published his seminal essay on photography, and Baudrillard was about to publish his on simulacra. The young man standing at the top of the airplane passage and steps had no idea then of what theoretical postmodernism was, but the works in the portfolio under his arm were intuitively exploring issues pertaining to it. The works were concerned with the notion of image, the contrasting nature of its existence in the form of either painting or photograph, and the respective implications of these mediums in the human perception of time and space. My stepping into what I would later call the Singapore simulacra happened just in between the publications of Camera Lucida and Simulacra and Simulation. This was certainly nothing but coincidental, yet a part of me strangely felt like I was on a mission. My venture into advertising didn't last very long. The commercial dimension defining much of the work and the relation to the clients just wasn't my cup of tea. Within a year, I had diverted my activities to the more satisfying exchange taking place in a classroom between a French language teacher and his students. I also found artistic excitement and fulfillment as an events organizer with Talking Eyes, a company started by François Verlet with a vision to use the power of music and light to change the world. We organized wild nights combining kampong life and disco beat, dreamlike settings and outrageous performances, beautiful people and luscious fruits. We also worked on more respectable projects, such as the audiovisual presenting the coming MRT to the local population. A third activity soon began to be very appealing as well: photojournalism. It combined social interaction with artistic practice, while offering the opportunity to travel far and wide. A few early contributions to various local magazines gave me the confidence to make contacts with their Parisian counterparts on the occasion of my first trip back to France in March 1984. A friend brought my attention to a new title, a magazine called City. It mostly focused on urban lifestyle in French cities, but also included stories about foreign cities. The editorial guideline was reflective of the trends initiated by leading titles such as The Face in the UK or Actuel in France. As a way to set itself apart, City had opted for the radical aesthetic choice of using only black and white photographs for its illustrations. The possibility of an article about Singapore, discussed with the editor, sent me back to Asia with an exciting task in mind: to write about and photograph my newfound home and share my impressions of it with my compatriots. Most significantly, the photograph would have to be black and white. After 4 years of using color slides, I was pleased to go back to the beloved practice of black and white street photography that had been an important part of my school years in Marseille. I was lucky to come to Singapore in time to catch substantial remnants of its earlier colonial identity. Singapore, the independent nation, was barely 16 years of age then, and it had already actively engaged in the radical process of reinventing itself under the rigorously paternalistic leadership of Lee Kuan Yew. The city was in the midst of a deep transformation that waited for no one. Yet, many pockets of the pre-independence urban environment remained alive. The result was a highly attractive contrasting coexistence of past and future wherever one went. At first, unaware of how radical and relentless this transformation of the urban landscape and society could be, I had naively missed out on the documentation of some fast disappearing important aspects. 2 years after my arrival, for example, the river boats and trading activities, at the heart of the city existence since 1819, were gone. And all I had for it in my image bank were a couple of color slides showing hardly anything more than tight croppings of the boats. By 1984, however, I had grown much more aware of the significance of this moment in time. The city progressed eagerly towards the future, with one foot in the Asian past and the other in the rising global world. Countries of the Pacific Rim were calling for a redefined role of their prominence. The catchphrase in the foreign press was the 4 Asian Tigers, and Singapore was one of them. The streets of the newborn nation felt as if they could hardly decide between a deeply rooted but nonetheless vanishing colonial character and the emergence of a confident independence driven by a buoyant self-induced modernity. Contrasting cultures, moods, and flavors defined everyday life, all things that made great topics for black and white photography. In the end, the article for City magazine never happened. But 6 months later, I had shot a good 10 films. Not a lot by today's digital standard, but they covered much of the city, from Shenton Way to Orchard Road, from Chinatown to Bugis Street, from Joo Chiat to Kampong Glam, not forgetting the fast-spreading new towns to complete the picture. My exploration had also taken me all the way to the remote kampong houses in the Sambawang jungle, where 4 years later, the artist's village would find a home. I started printing the negatives in the darkroom of a friend. The images were interesting. I had put a great deal of attention to shooting in the tradition of Cartier-Bresson, capturing moments for which no cropping would be needed to nail the image. But the experimental artist in me quickly identified them as the basis for adventurous interpretations, such as would be better suited to convey the process of transformation that so fascinated me. People generally identify me as a photographer. In truth, I have never perceived myself as such, or rather not just that. My practice has always been very diversified and includes a wide range of mediums and disciplines. In the summer prior to entering my photo school, I produced a work that explored the dialogue between photography and painting and their respective relation to time and space. It had been a decisive step, a turning point that outlined the direction of my practice for the long term. Most importantly, it defined me as an artist who uses photography rather than a photographer-artist. This dichotomy has been at the heart of the medium's nature from the start. By the 1930s, the modernist experiment extended its influence beyond the purely photographic field, so much so that by the 1970s it became a prominent aspect of contemporary art. That was precisely where I stood, and I was about to share this shift in my practice with Singapore. Leaving the camera aside, I went back to my acrylic and spray and paints and inks and crayons. Through the use of the painted photograph technique, the documentary images became a conceptual series featuring a range of moods that complemented or subverted the original visual content. The series started in the most traditional form of street photography, moment in time framed by the black border of the negative to indicate the absence of cropping. But as the black and white narrative unfolded, color progressively appeared. At first, discreetly seeping in, it used the traditional hand tinting technique that aimed to produce a realistic color photograph when no technology could do so. Soon, color developed a character of its own, and with bold assurance, it turned assertive to the point of fully overtaking the photographic quality with a pictorial blast of expressionist hues. From vanishing reality to unrestrained fiction, this approach matched my intention. It visualized the dynamic of the shrinking, disappearing pockets of traditional lifestyle replaced by the increasingly dominating futuristic skyline. The resulting graphic progression reflected the fleeting quality of this moment of irreversible transition from glorious past to no less glorious tomorrow, from black and white to color, Singapore from BW to C. By mid-1985, I had an exhibition ready to present. This was when my employment pass as a French teacher was not renewed due to economic bad times. I had to leave. But the time felt right. This turn of events was in fact pushing me to hit the road and pursue travel photojournalism as the focus of my commercial activity. All was well. The exhibition would make the perfect farewell to Singapore and France. Enters Lucina Talib, a Corsican countess, married to Yusuf Talib, a Singaporean historian of Arab descent. a wonderful, lively, extravagantly generous lady who ran an antique business from her home filled with curios and pets. She also had a large carpentry workshop in a flatted factory in MacPherson. Half of it was used to store a shambles of old furniture, remnants of the disappearing shop houses, often found abandoned in deserted back lanes. The other half was occupied by the workshop proper. This was where a team of dedicated workers fixed, polished, brought back to life the shine and memories of these anonymous pieces of local history. Lucina loved art. In fact, she was and still is an artist at heart, but one whose medium is simply life, with a capital L for all the love that goes into it. She offered to present the show in her workshop. This was to be the first use of a tactic that would become a defining element of my practice: the presentation of artworks out of the gallery in an everyday life environment, preferably relating to the content of the work. And so, on the 16th November 1985, the fourth floor of the Beaverton building in Tannery Lane became the site of what I believe to have been the first exhibition held in the industrial space of a Singaporean flatted factory. This was a one-night-only event, a happening, an informal riotous combination of art exhibition, on-site installation, and wild disco late into the night. At the turn of the 1970s, discos and bars were relatively scarce in town. Yet, the hard work put into surviving as an independent nation had brought a new wealth through trading and manufacturing. Something in the air said that the time had come to relax a bit, and private parties became a defining element of the Singaporean nightlife. Talking Eyes played its part in spicing things up with a subsidiary aptly named The Art of Parties. We took great pleasure in designing theme parties using music and art to create a holistic sensorial experience. The event most representative of our approach was the Magic Night, held in 1983 and hosted by Ronnie Pinsler in his black and white house. Standing out in this crowd of beautiful people was the Malaysian Jessica Leo, who in 1983 joined the Singapore Festival of Arts to work on its fourth edition. Jessica's contribution to the local art scene was to prove impactful in many ways. Most importantly, she brought art to the streets with the Fringe Festival, and in 1984, its first edition saw again the group Talking Eyes bring their quickie understanding of art to the new towns in the form of street art performance. In 1987, I conceived and produced the Yin Yang Festival, a one-week multidisciplinary concept event hosted by the Graduate Club of the Singapore National University. It turned out to be the platform for early public presentation of works by emerging artists such as Chandra Sekaran and Tan Mung Kit, who would become leading figures of the local art scene. It also triggered the comeback of the singer Siva Choi, leading eventually to the release of his best-selling album, Why You So Like That. The peak of this sprightly activity was the 1988 Fringe Festival and its month-long program of events happening all over the island, including 2 arts events in the recently vacated St. Joseph Institution, the Art Commando and the group exhibition More Than 4. These 2 events marked the first artistic use of a building that would become the Singapore Art Museum in 1996. This dynamic of change, fueled by carefree experimentation, defined my practice in the 1980s, and it was indeed a reflection of the spirit of the time. In the essay written for the exhibition Tints and Disposition, Jason Wee proposes that my bold use of color on the black and white prints should be seen as a distinctly queer disposition. Unexpected at first, this reading of my process quickly proved to be most judicious. The queer positioning was certainly not intended in a clear or even subconscious manner at the time of making. But the use of color in the works had assertively turned the ordinary into the unexpected. My early years in Singapore had been a period of sheer enjoyment and insouciant freedom. They had allowed me to become fully independent and truly myself in every aspect of my personality. Unknowingly, the use of color had effectively reflected the personal and emotional experience. It might sound paradoxical, but Singapore has set me free of preconceptions and self-imposed restraints. In fact, contrary to general perception, the Singaporean art scene of the 80s was far from being dull and constrained. Rather, it felt like a blank page ready to receive any story one might think of. Everything and anything could be tried and invented on the spur of a moment without having to look for space months ahead or for budget. The scene had the spontaneity and lightness of a youth waking up to endless possibilities. Both in its content, painted photographs, and presentation, industrial space gallery setting, the 1985 exhibition was arguably a seminal event, part of a handful of other similarly spontaneous and unassuming events that by the mid-80s began to shape the nascent Singapore contemporary art scene. However, this private and momentary event was not covered by any media, nor would it be written about by art reviewers. It thus remained absent from Singapore art history until the publication of the book Southeast Asian Photography, a survey by Zhuang Wubin in October 2016, when it was finally placed adequately in the chronology of this narrative. The work kept on growing with more black and white shooting for over a decade after that. It also developed in the form of diverse publications and designs, such as editorial pictorial essays, postcards, limited edition prints, and T-shirts. I even learned much later that one of the postcards had had an unpredictable influence on the future of architectural conservation in Singapore. By the mid-90s, the transformation of the city was almost complete, and the last subject I worked on, the colorful street of Kong Siak Road, would soon become another gentrified era. Even the most humble working-class places had taken on altogether different feel and look. They certainly remained very Singaporean in essence, but they had also begun to connect to the world through digital and electronic networks, the premises of a trend that had been the conclusion of the BW2C series, with the graphic variations applied to the Singtel building. The 21st century had moved in through the back door and actively begun to redecorate the place. Strangely enough, I completely overlooked the historically important district of Tiong Bahru while shooting in 1984. Fate is such that the 2017 exhibition, revisiting the 1985 There and Then, would take place in that very district, now emblematic of Singapore's identity in the here and now. Tiong Bahru is a remarkably well-preserved ensemble of modernist social housing architecture with few equivalents in the world. It heralded the development of the typical local new towns that have now spread all over the island. Today, Singapore has gained a reputation of a highly efficient modern metropolis, often upheld as a sample of successful urban planning that managed to harmonize structural and environmental requirements. And despite the widespread perception of having heartlessly destroyed its past, it is also in truth the only Southeast Asian metropolis to have implemented an early comprehensive conservation program that resulted in the preservation of many homogeneous districts of historical architecture. Yet, it is not quite sure if the colors of the here and now are in any way brighter and more vivid than the subtle shades of grays that made up the contrasted black and white of the there and then. The question of the balance between what we have lost and what we have gained can be debated, but the conclusions, if any, will be of little use and relevance. So complete has been the transformation of our life. Architecture is about making time hollow so we can live in it. And indeed, the shiny skyline circling Marina Bay screams 21st century for better or worse. The images of Singapore from BW to C too have found a new life when they shifted from the analog realm where they were born to the digital world in which they now exist. Since then, my concern for the nature of photography has also developed into a full-fledged concept, the constant self-recording mode. It suggests that the appearance of photography initiated the process of recording now underlying our society of information, a society defined in particular by constant and instant image consumption through various 24-hour channel news and social media. Singapore from BW to C was indeed about recording a specific moment in time, and the colors applied to the black and white images were an attempt at expressing a few things that I might have understood about this place that was no longer foreign, soon to be home, the eye of a stranger in a strange land that had begun his process of identification. They now exist online among the multitude of images floating around us in the virtual dimension of the web. Revisiting them as we do today, it would appear that they remain surprisingly contemporary and that the colors applied in the there and then are still fully relevant and vivid in the here and now.